Why the human race is going extinct this century. I should start by explaining this title, not least because it refers to an event which will cause more suffering and injustice than any other scenario conceivable by the human mind, namely the premature death of 8 billion or more human beings in the next 75 years. The title should not be read as meaning that this event is absolutely certain for two reasons. First, it is formally impossible to predict any future event with absoluteness, because by definition the future has not happened yet. Secondly, more practically, it is possible geoengineering and other technological developments may reverse the process of global heating. However, at present, it is questionable whether this technology exists, and if it does, whether it can be deployed at scale in the time available, given its enormous costs and in the context of widespread social collapse. Without this intervention, however, human extinction is effectively inevitable. At the present moment, then, there are only two outcomes. First, to maintain a highly developed economy and society which can roll out these technologies, or the end of humanity's existence. There is no third scenario now, no regression or progression to some pre-modern society that is compatible with continued human life. There are only two equilibriums, geoengineering or extinction. This is because tipping points in the Earth system have now been triggered due to the present level of human-created emissions and locked-in additional inputs of the carbon lag and air pollution. The human race being effectively extinct by the end of the century is now the main scenario, meaning it is a lot more likely to happen than not, and very possibly it is inevitable. What is absolutely certain is that a level of social disruption greater than any other period in human history is now locked in. I'm writing this text due to the publishing of new data, which now gives numerical starting points for the four most significant nonlinear elements in the Earth system: forest fires, methane release, ice melt, and natural carbon sinks, soil, forest, and oceans. This data gives a good enough all-system picture of how runaway climatic collapse will happen over the coming decades. What I want to do then is two things. First, to show conclusively that a new methodology is needed to undertake accurate analysis, what I will call an all-system iterative approach. Secondly, I want to show that when this approach puts new numbers into its model, it will predict human extinction this century. There is a vast and diverse literature on the philosophy and sociology of science, which is almost entirely ignored by conventional climate research and policy. It needs to be investigated if we are to understand the intersection between pure science and what is called data, and the interpretation of that data, which is unavoidably conditioned by human bias, methodological, epistemological, and psychological. For instance, it is not objectively clear what data should be researched, at what scale to investigate phenomena, or how to view the causal relationships between elements. The answers to these questions depend upon human purpose, which is, by definition, a social matter. As the seminal work, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, shows, the very way we use data is conditioned by a paradigm of understanding which becomes self-reinforcing, even when another paradigm could better explain the data, thereby producing better predictions. Climate science has an increasingly poor record of making accurate predictions because it is embedded in a dysfunctional paradigm. This failure reached crisis levels in 2024 due to the failure to predict or explain an underlying sustained jump of 0.2 degrees centigrade in global temperatures. The reason for this failure is that the conventional methodologies analyze only parts of the system, falsely assuming that these processes are independent of other parts of the system. It therefore assumes linear rather than non-linear change. This approach may have made sense in the past when all parts of the system were not linked up, but that is no longer the case. Only an all-system analysis can therefore make accurate predictions. There is now only one system, and that is the all-Earth system. To understand any part of the system, it is necessary to look at all of it. There is also a fundamental misunderstanding by scientists of the social context of their research. The traditional approach is rooted in a culture which focuses on research matters which involve no risk to human beings. The purpose then is to establish the certainty of a hypothesis. In this context, the notion of a conservative approach is one that requires a high level of supporting evidence in order to provide proof. An example might be the proof that a certain species of butterfly depends upon a certain flower. In this case, there are no social implications of such hypothesis. No lives depend upon the matter, and so this traditional epistemological approach makes sense. But there is an opposite set of circumstances, namely where human lives are at risk. In this situation, what would be called a conservative approach has an opposite logic to such an approach when no lives are at risk. This can be illustrated by the example of a conservative mother who will not allow her child to cross the road alone because the hypothesis that the child will be knocked over has a slight possibility of being correct. This sort of conservative logic applies to contexts which involve insurance, national security, health and safety and such like. Self-evidently then analyses of the danger of climatic change to human life firmly belong in the latter category. A conservative approach means a realist approach, which has to take account of low probabilities. A high level of proof is not required in order to take action, but rather quite the opposite. A classic example is the chance of an aeroplane crashing. Even a hypothesis of a tiny danger to the plane will lead to its grounding. This would be a matter of moral and legal obligation. The conservative approach, correctly defined in the context of mortal risk, requires then a taking account of all hypotheses, even if they are supported by low levels of evidence. This new approach then is to not focus on parts of the system or individual items of data, but to put them together in 10-year sequential timeframes starting in 2025. This way we can see how the elements act upon each other in real time. We can work this out by having two types of crucial information. First, the starting numerical contribution of a factor that creates global temperature rises at the present time. For instance, factor A contributes 0.1 degrees centigrade to global warming every decade from 2025. The second piece of information is the ratio between an increase in temperature and an increase in the amount that this factor contributes to temperature rise. For instance, factor A may increase its contribution to global heating by 50% for every 1 degree centigrade increase in average global temperatures. Once we have these two pieces of data for all significant factors, then we can make an accurate prediction of the key data points in the system through time. And the key data point is the increase in global temperatures at the end of each future decadal iteration. The mathematical nature of the system can be illustrated by looking at the game of Monopoly, with which many people are familiar. When several people play the game, it is possible to make a near absolute prediction that, although all the players start off with an equal amount of money, within the space of a few hours, one player will end up with all the money and all the others will have none. We can create a simplified model to show how this works. Let's say that the game just has two players. Player A has a complete set of properties and is in the process of building houses and then hotels. However, at the same time, player B has two sets of properties and is in the process of building houses and hotels as well. If we just analyse the player A part of the system, we would predict that the future will involve getting more hotels and thus increasing prosperity. But this is clearly incorrect because this part of the system is intricately connected to player B's part of the system. You obviously have to look at the whole board, the whole system, to make credible predictions. The rules are that each player moves a marker in turn around the board, advancing a number of spaces shown by the sum of two thrown dice. There is a substantial chance of A landing on B's properties and so having to pay rent, with the consequence of having no spare money to buy more houses and hotels. We could say the estimate of the chances of A landing on B's properties are 50% for each iteration, defined as the marker moving around the board once, while the chances of B landing on A's lower number of properties are 25% during each iteration. The odds of A not landing on B and B landing on A are slight but not impossible, say 1 chance in 4. If, however, A lands on B's properties, he will lose some of his houses in order to pay rent to B, and thus the chances of him winning will be reduced in a non-linear way, as he will be unable to charge as much if B lands on his properties. In addition, he will have to pay more money if he lands on B's properties, as B will be able to buy more houses and hotels with the rent money he gained from A having just landed on his properties. Let's say then, in this new situation, A has a 1 in 10 chance of winning. However, when he then lands on B again, he will have to pay even more rent and have to sell all his houses. Now the chances of him winning suddenly fall to next to 0, say 1 chance in a million. For A to win, B has to land on his properties, say approximately 10 times, for A to have enough money to start rebuilding houses again. And while during that whole time, if he lands on B's properties just once, he will have no money to pay the rent and go out of the game. This then is non-linearity in action. 1 in 4 moves to 1 in 10, which then moves to 1 in a million. The Earth system has the same essential structure. It is iterative, non-linear, while going out of the game, in this context, means human extinction. In the following analysis, I will not focus on the social effects of the various stages. I will simply show that these stages lead to the endpoint of human extinction. This reverses the conventional analyses, which look at the consequences of getting to a set level of temperature, for example 2 degrees or 3 degrees, while the prospect of extinction is all but ignored. However, if we are certainly heading for extinction, this fact is self-evidently more important than the various social stages that lead to that destination. The focus then moves from the incorrect conception of climate change as a set event, a point in time, such as reaching 3 degrees, to a correct conception of seeing it as part of a self-perpetuating and unending all-system process. This new focus then enables us to see that the most important fact about arriving at 3 degrees centigrade is not the social consequences of passing that point in itself, but rather that 3 degrees centigrade will lead to 4 degrees centigrade and so on. The same point can be made in Monopoly. The most important fact about the loss of your houses is not the loss in and of itself, but that this development will lead to the close to inevitable consequence of losing even more houses and then going out of the game in future iterations over the next few shakes of the dice. With these realities in mind, I will analyse the data and ratios over decadal iterations, 2025 to 2035. Establishing accurate initial conditions is crucial for the working out of any subsequent non-linear developments. For instance, if we double 2 and 3 several times, we can see the resulting figures increasingly diverge: 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, as opposed to 3, 6, 12, 24, 48. The present starting point for the Earth system is that the world is now at 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperatures. There is a confusion here because conventional analysis takes the official figure as the average of the past 10 years or 10 or more years. However, temperatures have been increasing significantly and consistently now for 30 years, and so a conservative analysis, using our risk analysis definition of conservative, would assume that the temperature increases are not suddenly going to stop or reverse, not least because emission levels are still going up. It therefore makes rational sense to use the present temperature, or at least an average of the last 5 years and a projection of the next 5, as a more accurate estimate of the present average global temperature increase. The second relevant fact is that the rate at which temperatures have been increasing has itself been increasing over past decades. From 1970 to 2008, temperatures rose by 0.18 degrees centigrade per decade. From 2010, this has increased by 0.3 degrees per decade. Looking back over the past decade, temperatures have increased by 0.4 degrees centigrade. Leon Simon, a scientist who works with James Hansen, stated in September 2024, the past 16 months are all warmer than any month before 2023, and comparing this with previous stronger El Nino to the previous stronger El Nino shows decadal warming rate of 0.42 degrees centigrade. Again, a correct conservative analysis would assume that the next decade will continue the exponential increase in temperatures, and the increase will be more than 0.3 degrees centigrade, particularly in the light of the data mentioned by Simon. So we should assume that we need to add 0.4 degrees centigrade to 1.5 degrees to get to 1.9 degrees centigrade in 2035. However, in order to do our correct all-system analysis, we need to consider all other developments in the system. To continue our analogy, we need to look at who else is building houses on the monopoly board. First, we need to take account of the effect of air pollution. The burning of fossil fuels puts small particles into the air, aerosols, which reflects the sun's rays. As and when fossil fuel burning stops, the particles will fall out of the atmosphere, allowing more of the sun's rays to enter the atmosphere and thus raise temperatures. There are numerous papers providing evidence for this and suggesting that when the burning stops, between 0.5 degrees centigrade and 1 degree centigrade will be added to global average temperatures. In addition, there has been estimated underlying temperature increase of 0.2 degrees centigrade during 2023 to 2024, which has been partially explained by the reduction of air pollution by global shipping. A conservative analysis has to take account of such an insignificant factor. For the purposes of this analysis, then, we will assume that the amount still to be added to the atmosphere by the removal of air pollution is 0.5 degrees centigrade, and 0.1 degrees centigrade of this has already come through. This leaves 0.4 degrees centigrade to be added as future pollution levels decline. We shall assume that pollution continues to decline over the coming decade, and so we need to add another 0.1 degrees centigrade to global temperatures by 2035, raising the running total from 1.9 degrees centigrade to 2 degrees centigrade. Secondly, we need to add in the data from feedback processes of other parts of the system. I will take these one by one. Forest fires. The Canadian fires of 2024 emitted the same amount of carbon as yearly emissions of the United States. The US emits 5 to 10 GT year. If we assume that an average of 7.5 GT/year, then this is 19% of global emissions from human activities, which are presently at around 40 GT. Over the next 10 years, 40 GT of human emissions will produce, we estimate, 0.4 degrees centigrade of heating. And so US emissions will produce 1/5 of that total, 0.08 degrees centigrade. In view of the occurrence of major forest fire episodes in Canada, Siberia and Australia since 2019, we can assume that over the next 10 years, a 2024 Canada scenario will happen on average every 2 years, bearing in mind the average temperature over the next decade will be around 1.8 degrees centigrade. This means that additional temperature increases from forest fires over the next decade will be 0.08/2 equals 0.04 degrees centigrade. Permafrost melt. The 2024 State of the Cryosphere report gives estimates of greenhouse gas emissions from melting permafrost at various levels of global warming. At 1.5 degrees centigrade, the estimate is 2.5 GT/year, 6% of annual total emissions, and so we should add 6% of the 0.4 degrees centigrade of these emissions, which is 0.02 degrees centigrade. Loss of carbon sinks. The 2024 Stepping Back from the Prefaces report calculates that 1/3 of human emissions are absorbed by land ecosystems, trees and soils, but the capacity to absorb these emissions has fallen by 20% in the last 10 years. We can assume that this capacity will fall by at least another 20% in the next decade as temperatures increase further by 0.5 degrees centigrade in the next 10 years. 1/3 of the total human emissions of 40 GT/year is 13.3 GT/year, and 20% of this figure is 2.66 GT, 7% of annual emissions. We should therefore add 7% of 0.4 degrees centigrade to the temperature rise, which is 0.03 degrees centigrade. In addition, we need to take into account the effect of the falling ability of the oceans to absorb carbon. There are not precise figures on this factor, but again, using a conservative approach, we should take some account of it. So we could assume that the total effect of the loss of carbon sinks is 0.05 degrees centigrade. Albedo effect of loss of ice cover. Estimates of the effect of a blue ocean event in the Arctic, no sea ice in the summer, is 0.2 degrees centigrade increase in global temperatures in the short term, and this event is predicted to happen between 2030 and 2035. In addition, in 2023 to 2024, Antarctica's sea ice loss in one season was approximately the same area of ice cover as the amount which would need to melt for there to be a blue ocean event in the Arctic. If this was an average yearly melt in Antarctica, then we can assume that this too would add 0.2 degrees centigrade to global temperatures. We assume that the joint effect of growing ice melt events will be 0.1 degrees centigrade between 2025 and 2035. The total effect then of all these feedback systems is 0.21, 0.04 plus 0.02 plus 0.05 plus 0.1, making the total increase in global temperatures in this time period of 0.5 degrees centigrade plus 0.21 degrees centigrade, making a total of 0.71 degrees centigrade, giving a new total of 2.21 degrees centigrade by 2035. 2035 to 2045. We assume during this decade there is a significant drop in human emissions in the region of 50% below present levels, not least due to the permanent world recession brought on by the economic effects of going over 2 degrees centigrade by 2035, therefore leading to a halving of the increase in temperatures to 0.2 degrees centigrade. However, the effect of carbon emissions on creating higher temperatures can take over a decade for its full effect, with an overall delay of around 0.3 degrees centigrade. It is therefore generally accepted that even if human emissions stopped entirely tomorrow, temperatures would still increase for a number of decades. So we can assume that over this decade, temperatures will increase by 0.2 degrees centigrade due to emissions from previous decades, giving a running total of 0.4 degrees centigrade. In addition, with a 50% drop in emissions during this decade, we can assume a 50% drop in air pollution, and so a real-time temperature increase of 0.2 degrees centigrade, half of the 0.4 degrees centigrade This brings the running total to 0.6 degrees centigrade. Next then we have to add in the projected effects of feedbacks from other parts of the system. Forest fires. Given the surge in annual global temperatures from an average of 0.8 degrees centigrade during the previous decade to an average of over 2.6 degrees centigrade for this decade, we can assume the equivalent of the 2024 Canadian fire happening once a year, doubling the emissions from the previous decade from this factor. That is 0.08 degrees centigrade, 0.04 times 2. Permafrost melt. According to the cryosphere report, temperatures of 2 degrees centigrade will result in 3 to 4 GT/year of emissions. And so, given we start this decade at 2.22 degrees centigrade, we can assume emissions from permafrost will melt at 4 GT/year. This is at 10% of 40 GT/year, which produces 0.4 degrees centigrade of temperature increases. This is 10% of the 40 GT/year, which produces 0.4 degrees centigrade of temperature increases. And so these emissions will result in a temperature increase of 0.04 degrees centigrade, 0.1 times 0.4. Loss of carbon sinks. If we assume another 20% loss over the decade in the ability of forest and soil to absorb emissions, along with a similar decrease in the ocean's capacity, then the additional temperature increase will be 0.05 degrees centigrade. Albedo effect of loss of sea ice cover. There will be regular blue ocean events from 2034 in the Antarctic and similar levels of sea level ice in Antarctica, leading to a prediction of a temperature increase of 0.2 degrees centigrade for this decade. The overall effect of all these feedback systems then is 0.37 degrees centigrade, 0.08 plus 0.04 plus 0.05 plus 0.2, making the total increase in global temperatures during this period 0.6 degrees centigrade plus 0.7 degrees centigrade, making a total of 0.97 degrees centigrade, giving a new total of 3.18 degrees centigrade by 2045. 2045 to 2055. We assume that during this decade, human emissions drop by half again, leading to a temperature increase of 0.1 degrees centigrade. The effect of carbon lag will lead to a last addition of this effect of 0.1 degrees centigrade. We assume that the reduction in air pollution falls to effectively zero, adding in the last 0.2 degrees centigrade of that factor. This gives us a total of 0.4 degrees centigrade. And then again, we add in the effects of the other feedbacks. During this decade, we can assume average temperatures will be at over 3.5 degrees C. And so we assume another doubling of the numbers of forest fires, and thus emissions, leading to an addition of 6 degrees centigrade, 0.08 times 2. Permafrost melt. Cryosphere report predicts emissions from 3 to 4 degrees centigrade to be 5 to 10 GT/year. We can assume then that these will be 7.5 GT/year, 20% of the 40 GT/year, and so creating temperature increases of 0.08 degrees centigrade, 0.2 times 0.4. Loss of carbon sinks. We assume a similar effect to the previous decade, adding another 0.05 degrees centigrade. Albedo effect of ice loss cover. We assume another 0.2 degrees centigrade as ice at the two poles continues to disappear for more months of the year. The total this decade then is 0.49 degrees centigrade, 0.16 plus 0.08 plus 0.2 0.05 plus 0.2, making the total in global temperature increase in this period 0.4 plus 0.49, making a total of 0.89 degrees centigrade, giving a new total of 4.07 degrees centigrade. 2055 to 2065, we assume human emissions remains constant to the extent of creating 0.1 degrees centigrade, and the other feedbacks are as follows. Forest fires. We assume another doubling of forest fires in a 4 degrees plus world, producing emissions of 0.32 degrees centigrade. Permafrost melt. We assume this continues to increase by 50% on the previous decade, producing emissions of 0.12 degrees centigrade. Loss of carbon sinks. We assume a similar loss to the previous decade of 0.05. Albedo effect of ice melt. We assume another 0.2 degrees loss. Put this together and we have 0.69 degrees centigrade, 0.32 plus 0.12 plus 0.05 plus 0.2 plus the 0.1 degrees centigrade, making a total of 0.79 degrees centigrade, which makes a total of 4.86 degrees centigrade, effectively reaching 5 degrees centigrade of global warming. Pathway to human extinction. The historical record of the Earth shows that in previous periods of runaway climate change resulted in a hothouse Earth. Most life on land died due to a fatal reduction in the quantity of oxygen in the atmosphere. This was due to the die-off of phytoplankton in the oceans, which produces 50% of the world's oxygen. Research shows that phytoplankton do not survive at temperatures of 5 degrees centigrade of global warming and may even die at lower temperatures due to the speed of the temperature increases that will occur this century. So it is effectively certain that after passing 5 degrees centigrade, human extinction is locked in. The decline in oxygen levels will take place over centuries, but humanity will not survive in its remaining ecological niches in the longer term. There are other possibilities of human extinction, such as from radiation fallout, nuclear winter, from nuclear war and/or nuclear accidents, but this is not certain. Extinction due to loss of oxygen, however, seems to be absolute and is locked in once the threshold of 5 degrees centigrade is passed. We are presently putting carbon into the atmosphere between 8 and 30 times faster than at any time in the Earth's history. It should not be surprising then to find that 5 degrees centigrade is passed around 2065, according to the above all system analysis, leaving another 35 years, 3 more decadal iterations before we reach 2100. So even if the temperature increases are stretched out, it is certain that 5 degrees centigrade will be passed before the end of the century and will continue to increase over the following centuries. The increases, in other words, will not stop. Escape from extinction. Humanity has a short window to prevent this runaway climate breakdown, involving temperatures increases of 0.5 to 1 degree centigrade per decade. The clear indicator of the coming reduction in fossil fuel use will be the physical and economic effects of the climate crisis itself, as temperatures go over 2 degrees centigrade in 2035. This reduction in human emissions, however, as shown, will not stop the exponential increase in natural positive feedback processes producing ever more greenhouse gases, given that we now know the starting stats and the ratios for these feedbacks. Geoengineering and earth repair technologies will therefore be essential if we are to survive. It is estimated that carbon removal will cost between $20 and $70 trillion per year. I assume that this figure refers to the removal level required to prevent temperature increases of around 3 degrees centigrade per decade based upon recent temperature increases. However, As the above analysis shows, in the decade 2035 to 2045, temperatures will increase by around 0.9 degrees centigrade, and so if it costs an average of $50 trillion a year to suck sufficient CO2 to stop a 0.3 degrees temperature increase, it will cost $150 trillion for 0.9 degrees centigrade. The present GNP of the USA is around $270 trillion. In addition, it will be necessary to significantly reduce temperatures at the poles because their temperatures are increasing by 2 to 4 times the global average in order to prevent albedo effects. This will require various untested solar management projects. And lastly, massive investment of resources will be required in the context of the direct and indirect consequences of storms, droughts, migrations, economic breakdown, as climatic extremities reduce GDP in the next 2 decades by 10 to 20%. The needed global effort to deal with these crises will happen at the same time as having to allocate 10 to 20% of global GDP to carbon removal. This may be technically possible, but it is far from likely due to the suboptimal political conditions brought on by social collapse, wars, and new nationalist and fascist regimes. The key tipping point in the whole system, i.e. the fusion of Earth and human systems, would seem to be around 3 degrees centigrade, when objective human, social and technical capacities will fall below the point needed to remove sufficient amounts of carbon from the air to prevent a runaway temperature increase past 5 degrees centigrade. The key decade then will be the one from 2035, while the technological know-how will need to be developed and rolled out in the next decade to be ready at scale for the 10 years from 2035. There are 3 possible responses to the outline I have laid out. Number 1, agreement on both the methodology and the input data. Number 2, agreement with the methodology but not with some of the input data. Number 3, disagreement with both the methodology and the data. While I am sure about the efficacy of the methodology, I am not sure about all the assumptions. I do insist, however, that a newly defined conservative frame should be used given the irrefutable appropriateness of the precautionary principle in the context of existential collapse. There is only one climatic analysis which is now useful, and that is an all-system iterative model. Any part-system model will lead to reckless underestimates of temperature increases because it will not take account of all system interactions. I would like readers to get in touch to be involved in creating an open source citizens model using this methodology to develop real-time analyses as new data is produced. This would create a public alternative to the discredited models of mainstream science subject to dysfunctional methodologies and political capture. This new approach can inform the new progressive forces which will be needed to guide policy as existing political regimes collapse, as conditions exponentially worsen. One more prediction is effectively inevitable, and that is that political revolutions will occur in the next decade as the horrors we face become plain for citizens to see. These revolutions will open up the political space for the small window through which we will survive this century. Revolutionary change then is now essential and therefore should be welcomed. It is in fact our only chance to create the miracle of human cooperation and innovation that we need. I will finish by returning to our analogy of playing Monopoly. When my son was 6 years old, he started playing the game. He would get excited as he started to build houses. He was still enthusiastic as he landed on other players' properties and lost his money and then his houses. The world still seemed open to possibility. Then he would land on another player's hotel, be unable to pay the rent, and so would go out of the game. His face would suddenly change, and he would leave the table and have a tantrum. I hope you get the meaning here. Wake up.